Today is March 12, 2017, and we are entering into the first day of Purim, which is the 14th day of the 12th Hebrew month. And of course, we'll be investigating Purim and what it is all about and whether or not it is something we should keep and all that sort of thing. But before we get into that, let us ask our Heavenly Family to guide us into all truth. Eloheinu, our mighty ones, Heavenly Family, thank you for guiding us how you have thus far. We really do appreciate how you have taken us, even though we have been so wayward and so far from you and so lacking in love and even full of hate to all that is good and true. And in spite of that, enduring with us and long-suffering with us in order to bring us to the light in spite of our resistance. So thank you so much for that. We recognize that we still have many things to learn and many, many things to unlearn. Please help us in tonight's study and discussion to advance in the principles of truth that you have been showing us. Help us to understand them and to live them and to learn from this something that will enable us to be a light to the world. Thank you so very much. Achoti, my sister, Chokmah, wisdom, please guide us, and thank you so much for your guidance. Father, Mother, we ask this, B'Shem Tzemach Hu Wahi, in the name of Branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
So, last night, as I'm assuming most of you know, since I'm assuming most of you were on the call last night, we discussed the defeat and death of Nicanor, who in the year 161 BC threatened to destroy the temple in Jerusalem and actually endeavored to execute genocide on the Jewish people. But before he could really make any headway, the hosts of the Jews, specifically the pious ones, the Hasidim, as it says in 2 Maccabees chapter 15, led by Judas Maccabeus, or Judah the Hammer, they went against Nicanor and defeated him and made a public display of his head and his hand, which he raised against Jerusalem in order to ward off further attacks. And in last night's discussion, I think it was a really good discussion and important for us to address the things that we did. And of course, the principles which we discussed in relation to that experience with Nicanor extend far beyond that particular event. It deals with violence both against the Jewish people and in response by the Jewish people. And we had to ask, hey, the way that the body of Nicanor was dealt with sounds very gruesome. And of course, this is dealing with war, and it is gruesome. There's no way around it. And we had to talk about violence and whether or not there is a time when violence is justified. Are there times when people are being so oppressed that it is all right for them to stand up, and even the right thing for them to stand up and to defend themselves, or let's say for parents to stand up to defend their children, or husbands, their wives, or whatever the case may be. And of course, that's what happened in 161. And I think it was helpful to compare that circumstance with the Holocaust, because really it's not all that different in principle. The Jewish people were under threat. And not only under threat, but people were physically coming against them in violence, and they had to defend themselves. And the troops of Judas Maccabeus, if they didn't do anything, they would basically be asking for genocide upon their nation and the end of their people. And so, just like if it so happened that during the Holocaust no one came to the defense of the Jews, no one today would object to the idea of a group of Jews rising up against their oppressors in order to save the innocent and helpless among them, and for them to do exactly what Judas Maccabeus and his army did in response to the attacks of Nicanor. Of course, at that time, as recorded in 1 Maccabees chapter 7 and in 2 Maccabees chapter 15, and the story in 2 Maccabees is in 14 and 15, but the aspect I'm referring to now is just in 15. When that event took place on the 13th day of the 12th Hebrew month, the people decided to make that day a commemoration from year to year in celebration of the deliverance that the Jewish people had from the hands of Nicanor. Because it could have been the end of them, but it wasn't. And that is certainly something worth celebrating, regardless of the horror of war involved in the event. Today, nations have annual holidays celebrating victories that they had, not necessarily conquests, although not saying that they don't do that as well, but there are victories that have been had where oppressors come against a people and they defeat their oppressors and preserve themselves, and that is a thing to remember. To look back and say, man, if it was not for those people who did what they did, we would not be here. And so that's what the annual memorial, as it were, of the defeat of Nicanor is about. And we talked primarily about the aspect of violence, though. We didn't get into the other aspects. I mentioned them at the beginning, but there are other aspects to discuss in terms of, are these sorts of holidays to be kept? And if they are, how are we to view them? And if they're not, how are we to view them? What is to be our relation to these holidays? Are they really holy days, or are they something else? And when I say these holidays, of course, I'm referring not only to the commemoration of the defeat over Nicanor, or the defeat of Nicanor, but also to the deliverance which took place in the days of Esther and Mordecai. And the celebration of that is called Purim or Purim, depending on how it is pronounced. I think that Purim is the correct pronunciation. And it, of course, this is a story which we are more familiar with because Esther ended up in the rabbinic Jewish canon, the Catholic canon, and the Protestant canon. And so many more people are familiar with the story of Esther than with the story of Judas Maccabeus and the defeat of Nicanor. We have in the past several years read from the book of Esther in both versions. There are two ancient versions of the book of Esther. One is the long version, one is the short version. The short version is that which is preserved in the Masoretic text. That is the Hebrew text of the rabbinic Jewish canon, and it also underlies the text of Esther in the Protestant Bibles. The other ancient version, the long version, is preserved in the Greek Septuagint, and it is preserved among some Christian traditions, and in the King James Version of the Bible, the original King James Version of 1611, the portions of the long version of Esther that were not in the short version were taken and then stuck together as one lump and put in a separate section in the King James Bible called the Apocrypha, and it was just labeled the rest of Esther. And that was a very confusing way to go about it, because all those different elements don't really belong just stuck together like that, because they are from various places scattered throughout the book of Esther, because it was just a different version. And so that kind of brought confusion, and we've talked about these things in past studies, and so I recommend for you guys to go back to those studies if you want to kind of get a feel for the book of Esther itself and what it is about and that sort of thing. This time we're not going to just read through the book of Esther, since we've done that before. Not to say that it's not fruitful to read through the same book multiple times. It is, but I think that there are other questions that we need to ask, and I don't think we'll have time to if we get into just reading the whole book. May end up having to read, a decent portion of it anyway in order to answer these questions, but I want to do it for the sake of answering these questions, not just to read it for the sake of reading it. So there are some questions that we have concerning the writings and concerning the feasts. So most people don't keep Purim. Most Christians, anyways, do not celebrate this festival, even though it is in the Bible. But let's just face it, most Christians don't actually keep any of the holy days or holidays or appointed times that are actually mentioned in the scriptures of their own canon. And it's really interesting. One kind of paradox is the fact that rabbinic Jews celebrate Hanukkah even though it's not in their Bible, and the majority of Christians have Hanukkah in their Bible but do not celebrate it. So it's kind of a odd situation as far as that goes. But it kind of highlights how people treat things within their own text. And this is kind of what we have to address with Esther, since most of us here have grown up in the Protestant tradition, some in the Catholic tradition, or at least spent some time in the Catholic tradition, in which case 1st and 2nd Maccabees would be in your Bibles, in the Deuterocanon. But in any case, we have 1st and 2nd Maccabees and the book of Esther, and they talk about these days. And the days that we're talking about right now are really the celebration of the death of Nicanor, or the defeat of Nicanor, and Purim, although Hanukkah really does fall into this same category. And the reason why is because these are appointed times that were appointed by the Jewish people in commemoration of historical events that were very significant at the time, and really these were times of deliverance, times when they were at huge risk of perishing and yet survived. And there is actually, by the way, another feast, the Feast of Salvation, or the Feast of Deliverance, that's also mentioned in 3rd Maccabees, that is a celebration, an annual celebration of the victory, or the deliverance of the Jews in Egypt in, I forget, it may have been the 2nd or 3rd century BCE. And the thing is, it gives the date in the Egyptian calendar, the date for the feast. And so I don't know what that is in the Hebrew calendar. And if it is to be kept, is it to be kept according to the Egyptian calendar or according to the Hebrew calendar? Or were they basically the same at the time? How exactly does that work? And are we supposed to keep that feast? How about the various feast days mentioned in the book of Jubilees? I believe the first day of the first month, the first day of the 4th month, the first day of the 10th month, and maybe even the 12th month. I'd have to check on that. But there's days mentioned in Jubilees that are supposed to be kept or remembered annually in commemoration of certain events that are in addition to the days mentioned in Leviticus. And then we have the feasts mentioned in the Temple Scroll, which is the longest of all the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in addition to there being a feast of the first fruits, Shavuot, or Pentecost, 50 days after the offering of the wave sheaf, 50 days following that, there's another feast. So after Pentecost, there's another 50 days and another feast, and then another 50 days and another feast. And then there's also a wood festival, or the Feast of Wood Offerings. And it talks about wood offerings and so on in Nehemiah. And according to Nehemiah, this was commanded in the law of Moses, yet that is not in the standard Pentateuch. However, it is in the Temple Scroll. So we have some of those questions to address. The Temple Scroll, I think, would be in a different category in terms of its feasts than something like the books of the Maccabees or Esther or any other text like that, because the Temple Scroll essentially claims to be the law of Moses, and the feasts that are given there do claim to be given by divine authority. They are claimed to be feasts of Yahweh. So these are things for us to consider and for us to look at. Is it that we should not keep any feast other than those mentioned in Leviticus and Numbers, because they are said to be feasts of Yahweh? And if that's the case, and if that's the rationale, then what about the feasts in the Temple Scroll? They claim to be feasts of Yahweh as well. Is it just a canonical theology that would cause us to go with the ones in Leviticus and Numbers? What about the ones in the Temple Scroll? What about the ones in Jubilees? Does Jubilees claim inspiration? Those are questions to be asked. I know that this kind of goes beyond what we'll get into in tonight's study and tomorrow night's study, but I kind of want to give a broader picture of the questions and the various aspects involved in questioning these things. We also have an interesting day that has been appointed in Davidian history, and it's actually called Davidian History Day, and it is on October 25 every year, and that's in the common calendar. It's not in the Hebrew calendar, it's just October 25 every year, and it has been a day, basically among Davidians, ever since the days of Victor Houteff, in which we would look back over our history as Davidians. So Davidian History Day is another day which might be considered like this, but whether it's given by inspiration or not, that's something to question. But the point is, it is an annual appointed time. It's a time that has been appointed by someone, and it's not in Leviticus 23. It's not in Numbers 28 and 29. Of course, Lois Roden also talked about an autumnal Pentecost, and we have discussed that as well. So we have an array of various annual days that are up for investigation. And again, as I've mentioned already a few times, but I'll mention it again, this time we're focusing mostly on Purim and on the celebration of the defeat of Nicanor. But it's fine for us to bring in other days, such as Hanukkah or what have you, in order to try to understand the principles better. So some of the factors involved are these. Do the books which speak of these feasts claim to be products of inspiration? That's one question. Another question is whether they do claim to be products of inspiration or not. Is that, in any particular case, relevant or irrelevant to whether the feast should be kept? Maybe a question that is akin to that in some way, but yet distinct, is if the writing which records these days and their appointment does not claim inspiration, does that mean that the days were not appointed by inspiration? Even if they are not appointed by inspiration, should they be kept or should they not be kept? How should they be kept? How should they be regarded? Should they be regarded as holy or not? How do we determine which ones we ought to keep and which ones we ought not to keep? So these are the questions. This is kind of the approach that I think will be helpful for us to take in tonight's study and tomorrow night's study, because it's just a good thing to question. We're here meeting on this day because it is a commemoration that is appointed from the days of Esther and recorded in the book of Esther. And for that reason, we are aware of it. We know it's a thing. We come together to study the subject. And in a sense, someone could say, well, you guys have been doing this for however many years now. And just so you guys know, this goes back to the days of Ben Roden, the keeping of Purim and of Hanukkah, at least. Of course, referring to within modern branch history. Obviously, these feasts themselves go back far further. So we've been doing this for a fair amount of time. Why question it? Well, we should question them. We need to constantly revisit what we're doing and question, is this right? And do a repeat of the experiment. Or do a new experiment, because we've learned more since last year at this same time, and the year before, and the first Purim that Ben Roden kept. We've learned a lot since then. And do the things that we have learned have an impact on our observance of these days? And if so, how? So anyway, that's essentially it in terms of what we, are going to cover. Does anyone have any comments or questions on that? Basically, I want to kind of like kickstart the discussion, see what you guys think, and we definitely want to simply find the truth. And so let's, in our discussion, keep that in mind. It's not about what I may think or what you may think or how much we enjoy or don't enjoy days like this. I assume we all enjoy it. It's about finding the truth. So, comments, questions?
You said that they started keeping Purim, or at least they were keeping Purim during the days of Ben Roden, correct?
Correct.
So, was he inspired, instructed, or, whatever term we might want to use there? Was he instructed that it should be kept?
That's the question worth asking. What do you think?
If it was during the time when he was an acknowledged messenger at the time, and he brought it forth as something they should do, then that's certainly what it sounds like. And then you said, maybe we should re-examine it. So I have another question. It's not to be, argumentative or anything, or facetious, but are we supposed to, etc., keep reevaluating? Are we supposed to keep the seventh-day Sabbath? Are we supposed to keep the other main feast? Are we supposed to keep reevaluating those, or would it remain the same because it was important then? And, I'm just kind of curious about how all that would work. So I don't really have an opinion.
Okay. Well, here's the thing. Knowledge requires experiment, and the passing of time is enough for confidence to be lost in a past experiment. Like, this is just the way it happens. Not saying that that's good or bad or anything one way or the other, although it is often certainly justified, depending on what it is, because things can change over time. So, but not all things change over time in every way. So this is what I'll say. I think it depends what we mean by reevaluating. If we mean by reevaluating that we have to entirely forget, all the past evidences that we've seen and all of that, and basically disbelieve something that we already know, if we've done genuine experiments, then no. But if by reevaluating we mean we do another experiment, then yes, we should always continue to do more experiments in relation to all things. That is actually how, this is what Ellen White talks about. She says that the knowledge of how to cultivate faith is the most important knowledge to obtain. And the fact is that the way to do it is by means of experiment. If someone does an experiment once, let's just say they read the 10 Commandments, and that's their experiment, and they find, it's the seventh day rather than the first day, and that's the Sabbath for them. Well, that's only so much. But if they decide, I'm going to, a week later, I'm going to check the Sabbath out again, and they go and they look into it again, and they do another experiment, well, they're going to come across a lot more. Did Jesus actually rise from the dead on the third day? We have done an experiment or two, or whatever, a small number of experiments in relation to that, and the results were quite plain. They were quite conclusive. But it doesn't mean that we should never revisit that subject just because we gained genuine knowledge on it. No, it means that, we need to do that again. We need to go and do more experiments in regard to that same issue. And we really need a variety of careful experiments. And if this is one of the, or I'll say there are a few benefits of doing this. When we continue to conduct experiments, unbiased experiments, on our own beliefs and our past conclusions or our current conclusions, it serves both to expose false beliefs that we may have, because we may do more experiments and find, oh, we were wrong on something. And it serves to solidify and confirm all the more true beliefs that we have. And so anything that we believe that is true, if we conduct more and more and more experiments on it, we will become more and more and more grounded in the truth, because we'll see, oh man, this thing has been tested time and time and time and time again, and we've done it from so many different angles, and it has never failed, and every test shows it to be true. Well, that's a lot stronger than just doing one experiment one time. So multiple repeated experiments from different angles certainly ought to be done. It will reveal our mistakes, show us our errors, and it will solidify the truth.
And it would also help us to, when you talk about solidify the truth and everything, the more we study over the subject, the better we get at it, and the better we can tell others, even to the point of having it memorized. So that part really makes good sense. And then wouldn't there also be a possibility that, I mean, not everything we've learned has been completely, how do you put it, fulfilled or revealed. And so by continuing to study, might something new be revealed about this old holiday called Purim. So I suppose that's possible too. Another aspect of that could be revealed by revisiting it each year, or just something to think as a possibility.
Sure. So, in regard to the aspect of Ben Rodin and Purim, that's something to consider. Was it that he was divinely inspired to institute Purim? And if so, would that mean that Purim is a divinely inspired institution? Or would it mean that our Heavenly Family says that we should keep these days and observe them and remember them, even though they are not holy days and are not themselves appointed directly by the divine? Or another possibility to consider is, well, Ben Rodin was Jewish. He went to Israel. He knew about keeping the feasts. He did not question the idea of Scripture canon. And thus, there's this day, and it's appointed in the Bible, in Esther. So, of course, it should be kept because it's in the Bible. That could be a very natural conclusion that one could come to, like, hey, God is showing us to keep these appointed days, these festivals, and guess what? There's even Purim is a festival in the Bible. Well, that could easily be arrived at simply by having a certain canon. So if that would be the case, it would be a common understanding, though not necessarily, perhaps not something that God actually inspired him to do.
I thought I'd just maybe offer a comment, hopefully clarify in case anybody now or later might be confused as to what you mean by God was showing them to keep these festivals. You're talking about those listed in Leviticus and, like Passover, Wave Sheaf, Pentecost, Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, and Feast of Tabernacles, the main ones. And then on top of that, there's these other ones like Purim. So it naturally follows to keep those two. Just wanted to mention that.
Sure, yes. Thank you for the clarification.
Comment?
Yes.
They're part of our history. And someone said that if we don't know our history, we're going to repeat it. And it's also God's story. It keeps our faith in God's ability to deliver us when we need it. So it builds our faith. It's our history. Good to know it.
Now, when you say our history, who is the our?
Believers in God ever since the beginning.
Believers in God ever since the beginning. Okay, so were the Jews in Egypt the Jews in Egypt who were almost totally wiped out by the Egyptian ruler, I think it was one of the Ptolemies. I think it was in the 2nd century BCE. This is recorded in 3rd Maccabees. Were they part of the people of God? And if so, should we keep the feast mentioned in 3rd Maccabees?
Not real familiar with what you're talking about there. Who you're talking about, the people in Egypt after they came after God got them out of Egypt? Or?
There were some Jews in Egypt. I believe this was in the 2nd century BCE. And they were almost totally killed. This is talked about in 3rd Maccabees. And there was an appointed time, an annual festival that was appointed.
So not
in that
the
day.
Exodus from Egypt, Leroy, that you mentioned there. Not that group of people of Jews in Egypt. Many, many, many years, 100,000 years later from that Exodus, there were Jews who were in Egypt.
Or they were just there. They had been lost their own country and went to Egypt for safekeeping or something. I don't know. I know that God watches over His people, so without knowing what their history or situation was. Anyway, that's what the Bible's all about, is knowing God's love. And when I was in my sick time, I thought God had given up on me because I really didn't know God very well. But when things happen, I thank God for it, because something good will come out of it. God doesn't give up on anybody. We're the ones that gives up on Him. Don't take advantage of His opportunities.
So the reason why I asked who the our is because there were different groups of Jews at different times, and not all Jews kept the same holy days or holidays. I don't know if all Jews kept Hanukkah. I don't know if all Jews kept Purim. There's some Jews kept certain holy days that other Jews didn't. There are the holy days mentioned in the Temple Scroll, and they weren't kept by all Jews. The holy days mentioned in the Book of Jubilees, they were not kept by all Jews. Different Jews followed different calendars at different times. There were the Jews in Elephantine Egypt. They had different days. And so the thing is, what counts if we're going to say something is part of our history and therefore it should be kept? Who is included in the hour, and how we would determine if that is a sound principle, of keeping it because it's part of our history. How do we determine what is included in our? So I think that's an important question to ask, and because if we can't answer that question to determine who is our, well, then basically we won't be able to get anywhere in terms of determining which feasts to keep and which feasts not to, based on that principle.
I think everybody that believes in God, they believe they are the true one, but God always has even though there's lots of scattered groups, doesn't he? Where they, Mr. Wisdom, and other Jews,
so what about Jeroboam? This is just after the death of Solomon. The kingdom of Israel, which was before then a 12-tribe kingdom, it was split in two. And there were the 10 tribes and there were the 2 tribes. The 10 tribes were part of the northern kingdom, and they kept certain feasts. I think there was a feast in the 8th month and things like that were not the feasts that the people in the kingdom of Judah kept. But the people in the kingdom of Israel, they believed that they were the true people of Yahweh. And they were part of the children of Israel. So should we then keep the feasts that they kept?
We don't really consider they split off from the 2 tribes that God, where the temple was. They were the ones that God honored mainly, right? So God always has a people, like right now we believe we're His chosen group to help other people to come closer to God. And Davidians in their day, and Seventh-day Adventists when they come on the scene, and Millerites for special people.
Okay, so of course from the Jews' perspective, maybe I'll say the Judahite perspective, the southern kingdom, the 10 tribes were astray, but from their perspective, they weren't astray. They were the ones that were following the truth. So, how would we apply this? Like, how about Esther and Mordecai? Are they part of are they part of the true people?
Were they representing God, right? Or the 10 tribes they went astray after they separated, and then they started making their own temple and sacrifices, so they definitely weren't still God's people, because they were teaching people to worship idols. The 2 tribes was the ones that were closest.
Okay, so the point that I'm trying to get to is that it's not being defined clearly enough who exactly our is, right? Because we can ask the question, okay, well, Esther and Mordecai, should we keep Purim? And if it's because it's part of our history, okay, well, is it just because they're Jews? And how do we define Jew? I mean, at one point we would have said Israel, but then Israelites disagreed with each other. You have the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes. So then we have to be more selective. We had to choose either the 10 tribes or the 2 tribes. So, okay, well, if we go with the 2 tribes, then that's okay. So we continue on with that. And then we say, okay, so Jews. But then there's a problem, because just like not all Israelites agreed, there was difference and disagreement between the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes. Just so, there was disagreement among the Jews, even in terms of which feast to keep and all of that. So that's why I'm saying, well, how about Purim? do we have any, how do we know that that feast was actually kept by the people of God? Of course, those who kept it believed that they were the people of God, so that can't be the criteria. Most scholars think that the Qumran community did not keep Purim, partly because it's not listed in any of their calendars, even though they list other feasts. And another reason is because the book of Esther wasn't found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Is there any evidence that Jesus or his early followers kept Purim? So did they consider Purim to be one of the feasts to be kept? Did they consider the book of Esther to be part of their sacred writings?
Could I interject a question here?
Sure.
Have we ever studied out whether or not Esther was part of sacred scripture or not, since it wasn't found in the Dead Sea Scrolls?
I don't know if we have had a specific study just on that point together. On the calls, we have studied the book of Esther in its different forms and so on. But I don't think that we've studied that, but that's exactly what we're here to do now, although it's broader than that, but that's one of the things that we are here to discuss.
That's one of the implications of the question we're asking.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good question that most people wouldn't even think about. So, yeah, I'm following you. Go ahead.
Yeah, most people don't think independently of a canon, and that's, one of the things that our Heavenly Family has been showing us is to realize the importance of thinking and asking questions and giving thought to, why do I believe this? Is it something that I actually know? If I don't actually know it, should I believe it?
Exactly, and that's why I'm asking these questions, so you guys know I'm not trying to make an argument in favor of one position or another in regard to Purim or in regard to Hanukkah or in regard to any of these things. I'm trying to encourage you guys to ask these questions and to think about it and to realize that we need to have consistency. We need to have principle in this, not just going with something because it's our tradition or whatever. Because let's just say one of you guys says, yes, we should keep Esther. And then I ask why.
Esther or Purim?
Sorry, we should keep Purim because, it's in the book of Esther and so on and so forth. And I ask, well, why? Why do you believe that we should keep that and all of that? And you say, well, and I'll just use Leroy's example, because it's part of our history. So then my follow-up question has to be, well, what is part of our history? What do we count as our history? We are humans. There's human history, and there's a whole bunch of holy days or appointed times by a whole bunch of humans in different times. So, okay, are we talking about Israelites? Okay, if we're not talking about Israelites as in all 12 tribes, because that would include the 10 tribes, are we talking about Jews? Well, the Jews disagreed with each other on different things, and does that, if Esther's included just because it's part of Jewish history, does that also then mean that Jubilees and the feasts mentioned in the book of Jubilees are included? And how about the feasts mentioned in the Temple Scroll? And how about the feast mentioned in 3rd Maccabees? There's all these different feasts. And so if we're going to say just because it's part of Jewish history, well, then we have a whole bunch of feasts to add to our calendar. But there's a problem, because even among Jews, different Jews kept different feasts, and some of them rejected other feasts, and some of them kept the feast at different times. They had different calendars that they went by. So it doesn't seem to be that we can simply just accept all of that because it's from Jews. So that's something to say, okay, well, what is the principle? And let's be consistent with it and really think about it as to why. If we're going to keep something, why are we keeping something? And what does it mean to, quote-unquote, keep it? And all of that. Go ahead.
Okay, so I want to offer a thought. In the present day, let's just take Davidians as an example of an equivalent of, like, the Jewish people, anciently. Today, we're branch Davidians, and we share a history with Davidians and Seventh-day Adventists. And as we go back in our line of truth or whatever, the line that brought us to where we are now, when we go back, we get to Lois and we see, okay, well, from Lois, then there was Doug, and then we came through Doug's line. But after Lois, there was also other people who claimed to be inspired messengers and separate and distinct from Doug. So they branched off, and they have their own groups, and those are also people that call themselves branch Davidians. So let's say they're all, some do, at least.
Or I think more accurately, they claim to be successors to the branch Davidian movement.
And so you might say that they're like another sect of Jews. They're part of Davidians, part of Jews. Okay, so I'm paralleling. I'm not saying that they are Jews. I'm using Davidians to point us back to the more ancient times of Jewish people. Okay, so then if you were to go back from Lois to Ben, then you would have even more people before Lois that rejected Lois's message, and whether they claim to have an inspired message necessarily isn't really even maybe my point, but they claim to have now the truth. Now their line is the truth. So you have all these different sects of Davidians, these different satellite groups of Davidians. And then you go back from there to, Victor Hottest Day, and then back to White's Day, Adventism, where you have all these different Adventist groups. Okay, so they're all Adventists, and then many of those are Davidian Seventh-day Adventists, and then many of those are branch Davidians. They identify as that, and we identify as branch Davidians. The thing that we would see that makes us distinct and different from some of the other groups are that we believe we have the true inspired messengers at the head of our movements. And if that is the identifying criteria for, let's say, I use this term loosely, but quote unquote God's people, because I think everyone here knows that I don't believe that only people in our group are God's people. God has people all throughout the earth. But they will manifest, like when they're presented with the truth, if they are God's people, they will, when they have the truth presented to them, they will take a hold of the truth. They'll advance with the light, just as we have chosen to advance with certain points of truth, certain points of light. Well, in the days of let's say, 200 or 300 BC, or even Jesus' time, or what have you, if you keep going back in the line of truth, if we were to say our history, I could envision it as, who is the our? I could envision it as all of the groups who have been in the line of truth with either an inspired messenger, bringing the truth present for the day, or if there was a quiescent period where there was no living prophet, because there have been times like that, take the time of the judges. Well, when the judge would die, then people would go into apostasy, and then they'd be taken captive, and then there'd be this delivery. God would raise up another judge or another messenger, and then they'd be delivered again, and that sort of thing. So that is what I'm wondering is, would that be the our? Like if we were to say our history, aside from the story of Esther or whatever, if we're just talking, we want to know what our history is, quote unquote our. Wouldn't that be going through a line of truth of inspired messages, even though God has people in other, present-day denominations and that sort of thing? And you could equate that anciently to, whatever, I don't know what, but it's a thought.
So the answer to that is yes, if that is what is being spoken of. But one could use the term, in a sense this is just semantics, but obviously semantics that point to different meanings. One could use the term our history to refer to something broader as well. I could, as a Seventh-day Adventist, I can refer to our history as Seventh-day Adventists, and I could talk about everything from the beginning of the Seventh-day Adventist movement and its prehistory up until the present, including all the things that are taking place in the denomination as a whole, even though that includes bodies that are broader than the branch movement, but the branch movement is still a subgroup within that broader movement. And so I could use our to refer to the subgroup which I believe to have the oracles of God all the way through in a very specific and direct sense, or I could use our to refer to the broader group of which we are a subgroup. And both usages are appropriate, both are fine. Obviously, when we're talking about holy days, the one that would be more relevant, most likely, would be if it's within the subgroup, if it's within that direct line of truth that you're talking about. If you have an appointed time that is ordained specifically within that, then it's a bit more straightforward. But that's not to say, and this is a question, what if there's an event that takes place to the whole broad group? Like, let's just say Seventh-day Adventists as a whole. And it includes the subgroup, which is, the line of truth. But it's broader than that. And let's say there's an event which takes place, and there's an appointed annual celebration or commemoration of that event of the whole group. Just because it wasn't unique within the subgroup, does that mean it should be not kept? And I don't know. I mean, that's a question to be asked. And I don't think that it's just an automatic no or an automatic yes. It's a question to be asked and something to be investigated. So, I think in a sense there are multiple angles to this whole thing. And the other aspect is, even if we're talking about our and our history being just this specific line of truth going back through the generations, what do we do with things that are not commented upon by messengers within that line of truth in terms of holy days? Like, let's just take the one in 3rd Maccabees. And let's say 3rd Maccabees is not a product of inspiration, it's just a historical document, but it talks about the appointment of this day. Well, if there's no comment on that by inspiration, does that mean that it's automatically not to be kept, or is it to be kept? And how does the lack of comment on it make a difference, or does it? Likewise, Esther. There's a question in my mind. The book of Esther and the Feast of Purim, is it really commented upon by inspiration in terms of whether it should be kept? And how does that impact things even if it isn't? Does that mean it's not to be kept? So, these are the questions to be asked, and this is what my primary purpose in this meeting is to get you guys thinking and asking questions and that sort of thing. So, any other comments or questions in regard to this?
I've got a continuation of my comment. I'm going to say that the hour refers to us, and also have a thought about thinking. With children, when they were in church school, they had a storybook that said, think, my good man, use your head. But we got to be on a good lifestyle and diet for our mind to work very good. So that's important, that we have a good lifestyle. But I think the hour applies to us mainly, and but God does give us power of choice too. It's not a sin if we don't do it, and it's not a sin if we do. I think that's the end of my comments.
Okay. Well, I hope that you realize that, in a sense, when you say the hour is us, that leaves me in the same place. Who is us? What do you mean when you say us? What do you mean when you say our? It's just another way of saying the same thing in essence. And so, and maybe you mean something more specific though. So who do you mean when you say us?
Those of us who are so far we're agreed on our beliefs, and wanting to be one with God and one with each other. People that come to study together, and wanting to be, I've always wanted to be one with some people, to be able to work with some people, and it looks like it might finally happen after 40 years, hopefully. It's a blessing to work when brethren work together, or how does it go? Eat together in peace. You can get a lot done when you're agreed.
So here's the thing: like what I really want you to understand, Leroy, is that still, like, when we're talking about something like this in terms of keeping feasts and our history, us, I think it's important for you to recognize that in terms of answering those questions being, should we keep Purim? Should we keep Hanukkah? Should we keep the celebration of the victory over Nicanor? Should we keep the Feast in the Temple Scroll in Jubilees and all these different days? To say that us and our is, people who want to be united and are studying and all of that is a very broad answer that doesn't really lead us to know whether or not any of those feasts should be kept or not, because it's so broad that I mean, it doesn't really specify still who we are actually talking about. Does it include Esther and Mordecai? Does it include Judas Maccabeus? Does it include the Jews in Egypt in the days of Ptolemy who almost died? Does it include the person or people who wrote and followed the Book of Jubilees? That those are the sorts of things when we're talking about specifying who is us. And I'm not actually sure if you're referring to like present truth believers or just anyone anywhere who likes studying and wants to be united with people, because I mean there's people of all sorts of religions who want that, and so it's like I think it's important that you understand that if we are going to answer those questions in light of the topic of finding out whether these days should be kept or shouldn't be kept, we need to be a lot more specific. And so, that's just one angle that we can approach it from, though, the whole aspect of, well, we should keep it because it's part of our history. And it's not that I think that that's like a bad reason or anything. It's just that if that is going to be a reason, we need to be able to define it, because otherwise, if we say it's part of our history, that can mean anything. And so it has to be defined. And so, go ahead.
Do we consider ourselves to be part of their descendants? Why are we keeping? We've kept them for several years now. Why are we doing that?
Right. These are the questions that I'm trying to have you guys ask. Why do you keep it? Why do you keep it? And is that a valid reason? And even I have to say also, when you said there, are we their descendants? Who are they? What do we mean when we say there? And when we say descendants, are we talking lineage? Are we talking in some historical way, in some religious lineal way, something like that?
It's too open to multiple different interpretations.
Exactly. We have to be a lot more specific. So, but that's my question. And I wonder, and maybe at this point people are up in the air, but if anyone here says, yeah, I believe, and if you do, feel free to say so. If you say, yes, I think that we should keep Purim, and here's why, I'd be totally, very interested to hear someone, give a reason for that. Or if someone says, you know what, in thinking about it, I think that probably it shouldn't be kept, and here's why. Well, that would be interesting to hear that as well. Or perhaps if someone has the perspective, well, maybe it's not required to be kept, but it's still good to keep and okay to keep, and here's why I think that. So I want us to at least be questioning rather than just being an autopilot and just doing it because, well, for whatever reason, and we don't even know. We need to be asking, wait, why are we gathering? What's our purpose? How are we viewing our gathering right now? Now, I will say, though, that I'm glad that we're here and to study this right now, because these things are valuable. If someone was to say, okay, let's end the call right now and just share and forget about this, because whether it's our history or someone else's history, whatever, it's just history, whatever, let's just do what matters now. There's a parallel to that in modern-day education, where the humanities are decreasing in, attendance and how many people are interested in taking classes in things like history and archaeology and those sorts of things. And more people are getting into the hard sciences and technology. And honestly, I can understand why. There is a lot of benefit to be gained by the study of hard science and technology. However, it is tragic that history is to a large extent being forgotten, because there is so much to learn from history. And if we do not learn from history, we will not be able to have an accurate understanding of the present, nor will we be able to avoid the mistakes of the past. And here's the thing, the present has been formed and altered by the past. And so it is absolutely an important thing to learn about our past, because the past puts the present in perspective. It is of consequence as to what Jesus really said and did. Like, for instance, and this is something that's debated, Muslims don't believe that Jesus was crucified. Christians do believe that he was crucified. I know I've given this example before, but for another purpose. But here's the thing. That question is of consequence. Yeah, it's the past, but it's not like we can just say, oh, forget about it. Let's just, share the gospel. Well, guess what? The gospel, as we understand it, is dependent on the past being a certain way. And if it is not that way, then it's not good news. It's just a fairy tale. And so we have to know the past. History is extremely important. If Jesus was not crucified and risen, then Christianity and any form of belief in Jesus as the crucified and risen Messiah is absolutely bogus. And that changes a whole lot in terms of how society is, how people think, how people behave, how people vote, how, the decisions made in the public arena, politics, government policies, laws, all of that. It's all impacted by how people understand the past. If it turns out that Muslims are right, which in regard to the crucifixion, I can say experimentally that they're not, and I don't mean that in any rude way, of course, but I just mean that it is factual and demonstrable that Jesus really was crucified. But that makes a big difference. Like, if it was the case that Muslims were right on that, that totally undermines the whole modern Western, quote-unquote, Judeo-Christian society. Likewise, if Islam is wrong on that, and Jesus really was crucified and rose again the third day, that undermines that whole society and religion and worldview. And that impacts a lot. Like, this is, international, even global in its consequences. And so I emphasize this to say, man, it makes a difference. There are presidents and people who have run for president in the United States who have said, man, I should have studied religion in university, because they realize that it shapes people so much and it influences politics so much and all these things. That's, understanding comparative religion and, world history, religious history is all very, very important. And the other thing is, if there are any of these days that we have not been observing, and we should be, we really should be, because we can't afford to miss out on anything. And our Heavenly Family pours out for us. Like, imagine this for a moment. Imagine if we didn't really care to find out whether we should keep new moons or not, and we just didn't keep them. Oh, man, think of all we would be missing out on by not observing new moons. I mean, look at all the people out there who don't observe new moons, and they don't get fresh fruit from the tree of life every month. But we are keeping the new moons because our Heavenly Family has showed us that that's a time when they will be meeting with us and giving us fresh fruit. And we do it, and guess what? Every time we receive it. And that's a wonderful thing. It has shaped so much of what we have been able to learn. So, in light of all that, it is extremely valuable that we are here right now and that we are gathered together this Purim evening and are questioning, hey, is this something that we should observe? What does it mean to observe it if we're supposed to? Is this something that was appointed by God? If it wasn't, does it matter? These are important questions, and it is of consequence. And I think that this is a very good use of our time right now in actually questioning these things rather than just operating in autopilot, because there's a lot of principle to learn from this that extends beyond the question of keeping feasts and so on.
Amen. I enjoy the third and ninth hour, spending time with Sister Wisdom. I just can't be thankful enough for that, and the 7 times of prayer that David spoke about. And it's just my faith is increasing. I just enjoy life. Have a closer walk with the Lord because you're spending more time with our invisible, at the moment, creators, along with the new moons, all the other stuff that goes along with the new moons.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know certain appointed times that our Heavenly Family has appointed. What we're trying to find out now is some of these other times, like yesterday when we read about the celebration of the 13th day of the 12th Hebrew month, that being the celebration of the victory that was gained basically over Nicanor in 161 BC. The record of that says that the people appointed the day to be an annual observance. It doesn't say that, God made a covenant with the people and said, keep my statutes, and these are my statutes, and these are these holy days, and this is what you're supposed to do on them, and it was a ritual thing, and it was prophetic, and all of that. That's not the way that this day is described in the books of the Maccabees. This day, again, being the celebration of the victory over Nicanor. Likewise, Purim is described as, the book of Esther is written as a historical account, and it describes that it was decreed that on this day Jews would celebrate the Feast of Deliverance on the 14th and on the 15th, and there was mention of the 13th also. It doesn't say that God appointed it or anything like that, but it was a day. Hanukkah, the Feast of Hanukkah, it's the same sort of thing. So our real question right now is, what does that mean? How are we to approach it? What is the truthful way to approach it? How should we regard these days? So that's the question. That is what we are trying to focus on. I will say, though, that we are coming to the end of our hour and a half, and we're going to have to hang up and call back in.
Yeah.
So I think maybe we'll do that now, and then, I'm not expecting us to, answer all these questions tonight. The main thing tonight is introducing them and getting us to start thinking about them. And then perhaps tomorrow night we'll come back and have answers to these questions. But I want you guys to be thinking about it and to go beyond the autopilot and enter into the realm of questioning and finding answers.
Amen.
So, in any case, we're going to have to hang up here and call right back. So, be back in a couple moments. All right, we are back. Thank you guys for waiting. So, does anyone else have comments or questions about all what we have been discussing?
Well, I just had a comment. This discussion reminds me of Ellen White in Testimonies to Ministers, around page 105 to 107. She says, "How shall we search the Scriptures in order to understand what they teach? We should come to the investigation of God's Word with a contrite heart, a teachable and prayerful spirit. We're not to think, as did the Jews, that our own ideas and opinions are infallible, nor with the papists, that certain individuals are the sole guardians of truth and knowledge, and that men have no right to search the Scriptures for themselves, but must accept the explanations given by the fathers of the Church." Then she said, "We should not study the Bible for the purpose of sustaining our preconceived opinions, but with the single object of learning what God has said," and then she just, I'll just skim all the way down to the end. She said, "If the pillars of our faith will not stand the test of investigation, it's time that we knew it. There must be no spirit of Phariseeism cherished among us." So that, if we have a pillar of, keeping, Purim, but it doesn't stand the test of investigation, then we should know it, just like any of the Seventh-day Adventist pillars as well. But that she said we should study the Scriptures with the purpose of learning what God has said. And so I guess I would just wonder if the people said, hey, we should keep this as a festival or holiday or whatever, is that what God has said to do, or is that what the people have said to do? And then again, we would just like everything, the only thing that will unite us, that will be perfectly united and sealed, is in the truth, and that's the only thing that could possibly unite us. And so we would just need to find out, is about the book of Esther, did God, is it of inspiration from our heavenly family? And I understand if its history is still valuable, it's just something different, but it just seems like, to keep a festival that God hasn't said to keep, I don't know, it seems like, like, for example, you were talking about the Seventh-day Adventists, of course, that's part of our history, but like if today they decided to ordain women and then they had Women's Ordination Day, is that something that we would keep because the Seventh-day Adventists, ordained women? Why are they ordaining women? Are they ordaining women for the true reasons, for the truth? I see on their, Facebook page, they have a lot of reasons for wanting to ordain women, but none of them, in particular, seem like the true reasons to do it. And so I don't know, it seemed like kind of a waste of time to celebrate, the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church today if it didn't line up with the truth and what God said to do. It just seems like we probably shouldn't then. But that's it. That's the end of my comment.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that comment. So it sounds like, although, maybe you're not necessarily concluded on anything in regard to it, what I gather from what you're saying is basically that it seems like the main thing should be to find out what God has said, and if God didn't appoint these feasts, then perhaps we shouldn't keep them, or at least shouldn't be required to keep them, or something like that. And I hear what you're saying in terms of, if the Seventh-day Adventist Church did appoint like a Women's Ordination Day or something like that, but it wasn't quite in harmony with truth, let's say, well, then it wouldn't seem to be the thing to participate in. But then there's the question, what if it was in harmony with truth?
Right, and it brings to mind some aspects for me, like, okay, on Purim, one of the things that has been set up, and you read about it in Esther. I don't remember if it's in both the short and the long version or not, but is the fact that on that day that they exchange gifts of food. Well, we know through an inspired messenger that we know for sure is an inspired messenger, that being Victor Hotov, that our Heavenly Family is opposed to time gifts. So food, there's nothing wrong with food. It's a good gift to give. However, if you're giving it because it's a designated time and you're expected to do so, well, that seems to violate what we've been instructed against doing by inspiration. Okay, so that's an aspect. Then you have another aspect of, okay, well, a time that wasn't necessarily commanded by our Heavenly Family, people have kind of instituted it. Does that mean that it's inherently wrong to recognize it or whatever? You know, it wouldn't make it a holy day. People don't have the right to make something holy. But take Hanukkah, for example. Okay, well, remembering the rededication of the temple and the altar and all that. Well, there's no tradition there of giving gifts and exchanging time gifts, so we don't have that obvious contradiction. We have just a commemoration of remembering the deliverance. And it couldn't always have been instituted because it was commemorating an actual event that took place at one point in history, not from the quote-unquote foundations of the world, right? So is remembering something annually, is that wrong to do? Well, you have Jesus present at the Feast of Dedication. So if it was wrong to remember it, seems like it would be wrong for him to be present there on that day, even if his intention was to go to witness. That's a question I have. Is it, you know, and it seems like it would be wrong to participate in a commemoration of something if that inherently was wrong. But you have Jesus doing that. And but the difference between Hanukkah and Purim are the time gifts. There are no time gifts with Hanukkah. Now, does it mean that by Jesus being there, it means that we are required to observe Hanukkah? I don't know. I don't even have a suggestion for that at the moment. But right now, you know, some of the thoughts, you know, I'm in agreement with some of the thoughts that Mary's bringing out, like, well, here's a question, what about this, what about that? Yeah, I have those questions too, and kind of the same logic train, I can be on board with that. And then these other thoughts of the time gifts are coming into mind as well. There was another aspect to this that was formulating, okay, that being other commemorative annual times that we know are against the principles of our Heavenly Family, that being anniversaries, like marriage anniversaries, for one thing. Other anniversaries, now, Hotov just uses the term anniversary. So I'd have to look at that more to see, is it just marital anniversaries, or is it seems like he uses it as inclusive of birthdays. And so it would be, if that's the case, then it would be inclusive of more than just marital anniversary. So he seems to be against yearly I don't know if I want to say commemorations or remembrances. It seems like a celebration more so.
He wasn't against all yearly things.
Obviously, right, Davidian History Day.
Yeah, Davidian History Day. Even New Year's, that was, Davidians kept New Year's and everything.
So did Adventists,
So did Adventists. It wasn't anything that was objected to because they didn't see anything objectionable in it. The reason why the anniversaries were objectionable is because of the time gifts involved. Though I don't know if that was to say that, I can say that it wasn't to say that just an annual celebration is wrong. Of course, Davidian History Day is one thing. They didn't see anything wrong with New Year's. Ellen White didn't seem to have, at first, a strong objection to Christmas.
Right.
She made some statements that were, at least giving allowance for some form of Christmas observance. However, her whole emphasis, like going from beginning to end, was weaning people off of it, and she gave recommendations of how to transform it into something that's others-focused rather than self-centered. And that was at the beginning, but then as time went on, she did speak more and more against it. Not only that, but when Ellen White was in Australia, she strongly objected to just, random holidays in the country. And she said that they were instruments of the devil.
Well, most holidays, most man-made holidays are just about self-gratification, ease, pleasure, entertainment, time wasted.
Exactly. That's why she was so against them. Yeah.
Now, aside from the aspect of the food gift issue associated with Purim, none of us have ever done that. We've not made it a point to, let's exchange gifts on Purim. No, we haven't done that, but we have gotten together so far every year on Purim and studied the story, studied the history. And it's so interesting to me because there is seemingly quite a lot prophetically in the story of Esther and Mordecai that seems to be speaking about end-time events and, correlates to some of the experiences we will be going through.
Okay, yeah, I was actually going to clarify, but you used the phrase correlate, and that more accurately conveys what you're saying. I just wanted to clarify, by prophecy, of course, you don't mean that it's making predictions about latter days. You're referring to typology, as in the events which took place there seem to match in many ways events which in other places, let's say the book of Revelation and so on, do prophesy as taking place in the latter days. And thus the book of Esther describes a history which, at least in some ways and to some degree, forms a pattern or a type for other events that will take place.
The typology is a much better way of explaining what I was trying to say. Yes, thank you. Because you have the whole issue of, just for one small example, the accusation against the Jews in the time of Esther was that they were separatists. They had these peculiar ways about them, and they didn't associate with the rest of the world. They kept themselves apart. They weren't a sociable people. They didn't participate in our customs and our traditions, and that's the Persians, right, talking that way about the Jews. And that was one of the reasons they were hated, the Jews were hated, is because they did not participate in the social activities of the worldly nation, so to speak. And, you know, that is definitely typifying even what is happening today, certain accusations against God's people, and or even just religious people in general, you know. That's one of the accusations. Oh, they're just unsociable. But like Carol pointed out in one of our studies, we're sociable. We're getting together right now. That's, you know, we're sociable with one another.
Well, and with anyone else.
Well, of course,
too.
But the point is that, you know, she was making at the time was, hey, we have social gatherings. It's just different from the world's social gatherings.
Sure, yeah. So anyway, in regard to Esther and typology and stuff like that, the fact of the matter is that history repeats itself, and the tactics of the enemy to bring destruction are repeated, and our Heavenly Family's means of giving deliverance are repeated. I mean, even just the fact that these three main times that we're talking about, Purim, Hanukkah, and celebration of the victory over Nicanor, all of those are talking about times when there is an incredible persecution against the Jewish people, and they're saved from it. And the day mentioned in 3rd Maccabees could be added to it.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's incredible that that has happened over and over again like that. And, you know, these are definitely significant points in history. And if we define our as referring to the Jewish people and identifying ourselves as part of the Jewish people, because, of course, the Nazarene movement, the branch movement, was within Judaism. It wasn't a separate religion. It was within that.
And Judaism isn't necessarily an ethnicity group.
Yeah, it's not an ethnic group. It was actually, Judaism
anyone who joined became a Jew.
Exactly. Judaism was never primarily defined by ethnicity. And plus, it's not even, Judaism is kind of a hard term to deal with, and this gets into other things that we're not going to go into right now. But it's, basically, you guys understand what I'm saying, though, that it's obviously these events that we're describing are part of what anyone would define as Jewish history, and by identifying ourselves with the Nazarene movement of the 1st century, which was a Jewish movement, we are identifying ourselves with Jews. In doing so, if we define our to refer to Jews as a whole, then all of that certainly is part of our history. And no matter what, it's worth investigating. And, you know, at least we can say that the time that it takes place is a decent time to investigate it. I know that there are, like, the feasts in the Temple Scroll. We mentioned the last time that we had a Wave Sheaf Day meeting, we discussed the possibility of meeting together on the other festivals mentioned in the Temple Scroll, if only just to study them, to investigate them, and to investigate the Temple Scroll. And we didn't end up doing that last year, but we may end up doing that this year, where we'll actually meet together on those days, not knowing if they are days to be kept, and we won't be meeting together to keep them, but we could meet to say, hey, look, we're studying so many other things, And we can't just devote our time to studying the Temple Scroll right now, but we could meet together on these days that the Temple Scroll talks about in order to study it. And so that's, obviously, there's nothing wrong with that. One could say if it's just a matter of meeting together, I think that it's important to say that there's nothing wrong with coming together on these days to study the events and to find out whether we should view it as something more than that. Just like, hey, we're supposed to gather together to study different things all the time. So, hey, guess what? We have meetings 5 nights a week on the conference calls. Is that something that is directly divinely appointed? Like, are those appointed times of our heavenly family in the sense of, like, holy times? Well, no. Our weekly meetings are not like the 3rd and 9th hour and like the Sabbath and things like that. But we are supposed to get together to discuss things, and we're supposed to study things together and so on. And so there's certainly nothing wrong with us doing that. And so the question is, okay, well, how about getting together to study Purim? And how does that also relate to even having times like this, such as Purim itself, like actually appointing a day like that? So anyways. So I'm looking at the time here, and we've been on for nearly 2 hours. So I think we should bring an end to tonight's meeting, and then we'll get back on tomorrow night to continue discussing this. And in the meantime, it would be great if you guys contemplate what we have discussed and think about what would be a good reason to keep or not keep Purim. Should we be keeping it? What does it mean when we say keeping it? Is there a sense in which it should be kept? Is there a sense in which it should not? What should be our perception of it and our behavior in relation to it? And of course, extending beyond Purim to the celebration of the victory over Nicanor, and also Hanukkah as well, and any other festival or memorial or like appointed day or whatever it may be that we have in ancient Jewish writings, and beyond that, even to things like Davidian History Day and the Autumnal Pentecost.
What was the time frame for Esther's people that story happened?
Oh, that's a good question. That was in the Persian period. Basically, it's in the early Second Temple times. So just after the Babylonian captivity. And so, like the first decree to go and restore the temple took place in the year 538 BC, that is, of course. And the final return, or the return of a large number of Jews, was in 516 or 515, thereabouts. And I forget the exact year that it was, the story of Esther and Mordecai and Haman took place, whether it was in like 490-something, 480-something, or somewhere even after that or a bit before then. But it's basically in the, I'm pretty sure it's the early 5th century BCE.
Oh, were they in Babylon, or they were in Medo-Persia, because Medo-Persia had taken over Babylon?
Well, it's actually describing events which took place all throughout the Persian Empire. But of course, Esther was at the king's palace I'm trying to remember the specific location. Susa, that's right, the city of Susa.
Or Shushan.
Yeah. But I think we should bring an end to the meeting for tonight, and then we can get back into discussing these things tomorrow night. So would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family? And then we'll close.
I will.
I will. You will.
Okay, I will. Well, Heavenly Family, divinely appointed or not divinely appointed, I'm really grateful to have been able to gather together with everyone tonight and to study into things and to just exercise our minds on these topics. And I really appreciate how you are waking us up and you're teaching us to not just take things for granted and to do things because that's just the way it's always been done, or that's the way we're being told it was always done, or whatever. And I'm just really excited about what the future holds and how you will continue to lead and direct us and to show us truth. So please continue the work that you're doing for us. Help us to participate in that work and to be focused in our participation so that we get the most out of it. Show us the truth of all things, Heavenly Family, so that we can manifest your love and your character to the world. So help us in the meantime between tonight and tomorrow to focus on these things, to try to find answers to these questions. And hopefully tomorrow, Heavenly Family, we will be able to come together and really come to a knowledge of the truth of these things. So we ask this in the name of Branch, and we thank you. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you for our minds.
Toda Eloheinu. All right, love you all. Have a good night. See you tomorrow.
Good
Good night.